Good evening, everybody. I'm Fictional Crystals, and let's talk about Lance's development. Now, an interesting thing I noticed about Lance's insecurities. Keith almost always gets brought up with them. In the first episode, Commander Iverson told him not to follow in the footsteps of Keith, who used to be the best fighter pilot there, except he dropped out. Lance just bombed a simulator and then was getting compared to a dropout. When Allura was assigning lions, and she was describing the qualities needed for Red, it looked like Lance was thinking he was going to get Red, but it got given to Keith. Keith got chosen over Lance to go to the Blader Memora. Lance was talking about all the cool stuff Keith could do, and right after he started talking about how useless he was. Keith got chosen for the Black Lion over him. After all of this, Lance decided it was Keith who he wanted to talk about his doubts with. Originally, Lance's rivalry with Keith was one-sided. He saw how Keith was excelling at the Garrison and he wasn't. Keith was completely unaware of this. Lance's rivalry with him was strongest in its early days. He kept wanting to one-up Keith, but Keith kept one-upping him. Lance used to see Keith as a hot-headed show-off. Then Keith's other side showed him when Shira went missing. Lance realized he needed to get over himself. He knew not to go too far, and that big arguments were pointless at this time. They ended up bonding because of grief. Keith was missing Shiro like Lance was missing his family. They weren't sure if they would see their loved ones again. Lance knew what Keith was going through, and he knew if it was him with his family, he wouldn't want people to make him feel even worse about them not being around. The two of them are no longer making things into contests. They are reaching equal ground. In the episode The Hunted, the Black Lion approached the Red Lion straight on. They were eye to eye. Even the background was a mix of red and blue. Keith was able to show his vulnerable side to Lance. You could hear it in his voice, he was on the verge of crying, which is not something he would normally do in front of people. Lance acknowledged that Keith had done something wrong, but didn't rub it in his face, unlike he used to.
Great job, Keith! You destroyed their guardian!
They just needed to move on. A few episodes later, Lance showed his vulnerable side to Keith. Keith had never seen the side of Lance, and like for Keith, it wasn't a side that Lance showed to many people. Lance was the one who convinced Keith to become the leader of Voltron. Lance ended up becoming his impulse control and right-hand man. The Red Line knew Keith would listen to Lance. The Red and Black Paladins are the first and second in command of Voltron. They need to be able to work together. Despite Lance and Keith's previous disagreements, the Lions knew Lance would work better as Keith's right-hand man over the others available. Even with Shira already back at this point, Lance viewed Keith as leader. He could have talked to Shira about leaving, but he didn't. He expected Keith to want him to go. He didn't want some nice supportive space dad talk. He wanted to hear the hard truth, and he thought Keith would give it to him by confirming he was the weakest link. But Keith didn't. He acknowledged that there were 6 paladins and Allura was a great one, but genuinely didn't think that Lance should worry about it. It gave Lance some food for thought. After leaving Keith's room, he stopped. He was thinking about what just happened. It didn't go nearly the way he expected. His smile at the end seemed a bit forced. His doubts are clearly still going through his head, and Keith didn't want to confirm them. Later that episode, Keith was the one willing to give up his spot as a paladin so that Shira could return to being a paladin, and Lance and Allura could continue being paladins. They have reached mutual respect, and they aren't the only ones. Lance used to view Allura as a prize to be won. It was clear that she didn't like it, yet he kept flirting with her. But that too changed in season 3. He stopped viewing her as simply a pretty face, and like with Keith, came to a mutual respect. These scenes look very similar and are in the same episode. Since this episode, Lance and Keith haven't fought, and also since this episode, Lance hasn't flirted. Now Lance is there for Allura, not because he wants to win her over, but because he genuinely cares about her. Him handing leadership to Keith and the blue line to Allura handed him a better understanding of the way he was acting and them. I'm sorry, but if you think Lance hasn't had character development, or that he's simply arrogant comic relief, we are clearly not watching the same show. He puts the needs of others before his own, and his development can only continue. His character arc is more subtle than, say, Pidge, Shira, or Keith's, but it's there, and it hasn't felt forced. He's been progressing at a natural pace, and I can't wait to see where this goes. But anyway, thanks for watching, and
Hasta la later, Keith!